Joe Biden has been teasing a 2020 run basically since the day after Hillary Clinton lost the election to Donald Trump. So far, the only people who seem to be excited about this are the center-right corporate establishment members of the Democratic leadership, people in mainstream media, and a few voters in the country who are still suckered into believing that the Obama administration was good for the average American. The reason for this is that there's absolutely nothing about Joe Biden that excites the base of the Democratic Party or even independents. At best, his domestic policies are center-right, neoliberal incrementalism that doesn't adequately address any of the major problems that we're dealing with in the country, whether it be the healthcare crisis, or the record-high wealth inequality in this country, or the unchecked corporate power, the lack of decent education. You go down the list. And in the area of foreign policy, he's just an outright neocon warmonger who's in favor of all of these illegal, unauthorized military interventions that the U.S. is currently involved in around the world. Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, Somalia, Yemen. Again, his policy positions are unpopular positions across the political spectrum, but especially among voters in the Democratic Party. Short of the DNC just openly rigging the primary in favor of Joe Biden, the chances of him winning the nomination fair and square are extremely slim. It will be an uphill battle followed by the moving of a mountain. I think by the end of the primary, Joe Biden's campaign will largely be categorized as an epic failure, especially since he's coming into the race with more name recognition than almost anyone else. That said, I do think Joe Biden will play a very substantial role in the 2020 primaries. Since Biden is the embodiment of the establishment, I see the role that he plays in the primary is to act as the perfect punching bag for progressives. Since there's been so much obfuscation and misplaced blame after the 2016 election, the Democratic Party has failed to look introspectively to find what actually caused the collapse of the Democratic Party under Barack Obama and led the radical far-right Republicans to take control of all three branches of government. Joe Biden's campaign will bring that conversation front and center. What I feared would happen if Biden didn't get into the race is that since all of the establishment candidates are relatively new to Congress, they will be able to slightly distance themselves from the devastation that the policies of the last 30 years have caused since they weren't directly responsible for it. Similarly, with the Obama administration, there weren't any prominent members of the administration running. I believe Julian Castro was at one point the Housing and Urban Development Secretary. But nobody really knows who he is. Nobody knew who he was back then. Nobody knows who he is now. Because of that, I was worried that the framing of the primaries would only be what's the candidate's specific record and what do they plan on doing as president, without really getting into the failures of the Democratic Party that led to the era of Trump. But with Biden in the race, that changes instantly. You can't have a conversation about Joe Biden's record or his career without talking about the direction that the Democratic Party has gone in the last 30 years. Because like I touched on already, Joe Biden, similar to Hillary Clinton, is the embodiment of the corrupt right-wing policies of the Democratic establishment that have screwed over the working class and minorities across the country. Biden really made a name for himself in the tough-on-crime era. He was one of many politicians fear-mongering about drugs and crime. He scapegoated the black community in order to win elections in a similar way that Trump and the Republicans do today. Biden was the one who wrote the crime bill, which included mandatory minimums for drug crime that exploded the prison population and mass incarceration, to the point where now in the United States we have more people locked up in prison than any other country in the world. That's including large authoritarian countries like China, Saudi Arabia, Russia. He carried that same mentality all the way through the Obama administration, where they both oversaw an executive branch that continued the drug war and did absolutely nothing to legalize marijuana. So the tough-on-crime era and the Obama administration's continuation of the drug war is something that the Democratic Party has yet to address. To this day, Joe Biden is still against Medicare for all. Like I mention on the show all the time, 40,000 people die every year because they can't afford basic health care. 30 million people in the United States do not have insurance because they can't afford it. 70% of the country, including Republicans and independents, support a Medicare for all healthcare system. Because of the price gouging private health insurance system that we have in this country today, medical bankruptcies are the #1 cause of bankruptcies across the country. Medicare for all would cost less than the private health insurance system that we have right now in the United States, and it would cover everyone. premiums, deductibles, prescription costs are all still sky high and continue to rise even after Obamacare was implemented. All that is true, and Joe Biden is still siding with big donors to deny Americans health care. The Obama administration passed the ACA without a single Republican vote. They could have gotten single payer or at the very least a public option. They did the right-wing Republican healthcare proposal that Newt Gingrich supported, that was cooked up by the Heritage Foundation and implemented by Mitt Romney when he was governor of Massachusetts. They pushed any chance that we have of getting a single-payer healthcare system back 2 decades at least. I just told you that 40,000 people die every single year because they can't afford basic healthcare. So now hundreds of thousands of people will die prematurely because of the corruption and the bad policies by the Obama administration and the Democratic Party. I strongly believe that that's something that should be hashed out during these primaries. On foreign policy and domestic security, Joe Biden is a neocon. Joe Biden voted yes on the unconstitutional Patriot Act, which allowed the Bush administration to start this unchecked surveillance apparatus that spies on literally everything that U.S. citizens do. The Patriot Act is also the legislation where all of these terrible, useless agencies like ICE and Homeland Security and the TSA came out of. Those agencies routinely violate privacy and carry out civil rights and human rights abuses, including the current immigration crisis at the border, where families are being separated and detained in concentration camps here in the U.S. In the last 20 years, Joe Biden has been on board with every single illegal, unauthorized U.S. military intervention. He voted for the Iraq War, an illegal war that was based entirely on lies. We invaded and destroyed a sovereign country against the direction of the UN, committed countless war crimes, killed minimum 200,000 civilians. There's some estimates that over 1 million people died in Iraq after we started the war. Created instability that has led to the rise of jihadists across the Middle East like ISIS. 15 years later, we are still sending men and women to die in Iraq, and Joe Biden still defends the war. That is inexcusable and frankly disqualifying. But if that wasn't bad enough, he saw no problem with the rest of Barack Obama's foreign policy. Getting us involved in Syria to overthrow the Assad government, where we directly funded jihadists like ISIS and Al-Qaeda on the ground. The coup in Libya, that was an abject failure. The escalation of the drone assassination program that is wildly inaccurate and kills mostly civilians. Obama's administration started the genocide in Yemen, which is now the worst humanitarian crisis on the planet. I've spoken about this on the show repeatedly. On foreign policy, Joe Biden is a neocon, and the same goes for Barack Obama. The Democratic Party needs to confront the fact that the foreign policies that they've adopted are overly militaristic and align very closely with the most fringe, radical wing of the Republican Party. So even though I don't see Joe Biden being a major player in the primary when it comes to vote count and overall popularity, I think the fact that he's even in the race gives progressives the perfect opportunity to expose the failures and objectively terrible policies of the Obama administration and the Democratic establishment. There desperately needs to be an autopsy of the Democratic Party. It needs to be made clear to the entire country that the corruption in the Democratic Party can no longer be ignored. Because if that isn't made clear, there will be some people who think that it's an open question of what kind of politicians and policies are required to get the country going in the right direction. And if there are some people who are still open to the Biden, Obama, Clinton types of politician, the establishment will find some way to insert themselves back into the Democratic Party. The establishment Democrats are largely responsible for the wealth inequality, the endless wars, the lack of health care, etc. The only path forward is to completely denounce the policies of the establishment and implementing the policies of social democracy and non-intervention that progressives continue to fight for.